everyone. My name is Eric Fausner. I'm the executive online editor of Golden Gate University School of Law's Law Review, and I'm sitting here today with Lori Mullins, who's the managing editor of the Law Review, about a class that you took last spring called Ethical Prosecutions. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you wrote an excellent paper about prosecuting cases vertically, a more victim-based approach. My first question for you is, what inspired you in Ethical Prosecutions to write a paper about victims?
Well, I think what I want to do is be a prosecutor, and one of the reasons that I wanted to be a prosecutor was to be an advocate for victims. And going through all the rules of prosecutors that we did in that class, I realized that there weren't really a lot of rules about advocating on behalf of a victim. It was always about advocating on behalf of society. And so my purpose of writing this paper was really to show that victims should have more of a role in the justice system, more specifically in prosecutors' offices.
Now, for those that are unfamiliar with what a vertical style of prosecuting is, could you please explain that?
Yes. So there's two different ways that you can prosecute cases. One is horizontal, one is vertical. Vertical is when the same DA or prosecutor handles the case from beginning to end. It could be all the way from arraignment, it could start in preliminary hearings all the way to the sentencing portion of a trial. In horizontal jurisdictions, a different prosecutor is assigned to handle each part of the trial process. So you have a particular prosecutor who does a preliminary hearing, which is when you present testimony from a witness. Then a different prosecutor would handle the trial, and then maybe a different prosecutor would also handle the sentencing portion of the trial.
So what sort of problems arise when there's a horizontal style of prosecution within a district attorney's office?
So the few things that I see as problems is, number one, that a victim or other witnesses have to tell the same story over and over again. So when you have somebody come in for a preliminary hearing, a prosecutor is only asking questions basically just to get on to the next step, just to have enough evidence for a preliminary hearing. And a preliminary hearing is a different evidentiary basis than a trial court. You know, almost everybody knows that you have to prove a trial beyond a reasonable doubt, but a preliminary hearing only requires probable cause. So the prosecutor is sort of thinking differently in terms of a preliminary hearing versus a trial.
Now, how do the victims fit in a horizontal style of prosecution?
So the horizontal style, a victim or even just a witness to a crime has to tell their story to different prosecutors. They already told their story in an initial police report, and then prosecutors bring them in to interview them before they put them on the stand. So they're essentially telling their story multiple times. I don't really feel like they are getting enough out of the process because it's almost like they're just being passed on from person to person. They're retelling the same story. There might be details that they give to one prosecutor that they don't give to the other. So, you know, they feel like their story might be falling into the cracks, and that might very well be the case.
So, from a victim's perspective, how does a vertical prosecution of a crime affect them differently?
When a victim is when their case is dealt vertically, they're primarily dealing with only one DA. So they initially tell their story to the police officer, and then that police report is given to a prosecutor who, you know, does the initial interview, who walks them through the steps of what a trial is like, and who's the one asking them questions in, you know, a preliminary hearing, who is directing them towards questions in a trial, and then also dealing with them in the sentencing part of the trial as well.
Do you think emotionally, if you're a victim of a crime, do you think that a vertical prosecution style makes you more involved in the process of getting justice for yourself?
Yes, absolutely. So some of the research that I did suggested that a lot of victims can feel re-traumatized in this process because it's always about the defendant's rights. You know, the defendant has constitutional protections that they're entitled to, but the victim doesn't really have anything. You know, the defendant is entitled to sit up at counsel table and, you know, talk to their attorney about certain things, and the victim is sort of comes in, gives their piece and leaves, or comes in and talks to a prosecutor for a few minutes and then leaves, and they're not really at the focal point of what the case is about. It's generally the defendant. So when somebody has been traumatized and it's pretty much like they go up, they tell their story, what happened to them, and then they get cross-examined by the other attorney, I think it can make them feel like they're not part of the process, that they're not valued. It kind of degrades their story a little bit.
A more victim-based approach is what you're advocating for.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it makes me think about, do you feel that a prosecutor should become emotionally invested in cases that they take on for the state?
I think that prosecutors definitely, there is a risk of being more emotionally involved, especially as you deal with a victim more often and more frequently. But I think that ultimately, the fact that you do connect with a victim and you're passionate about it is only going to make you a better advocate for them.
Do you think that in a world where more cases are vertically prosecuted and prosecutors are emotionally involved in the case and they do care very much about victims, do you think that leaves a room for ethical lapses of judgment on the part of the prosecutor?
I think that's a good question, and I think it definitely can, because, you know, some of the rules for prosecutors do say that you have to put society first. You know, you don't represent the victim, they're not your client, you represent society as a whole, and more specifically the people of the state that you're representing. So I think that there is a small risk, but I think all the benefits of making the victim feel like they're a part of the process outweighs that. And you still have a little bit of a risk, even in horizontal prosecution, you still have a risk that you're going to become involved, you know, in the people that you're representing and in their families, because they are still part of the process.
Prosecutors' offices, I'm sure, have this question. Is it going to be more effective for prosecutions for us to switch from a horizontal prosecuting process to vertical? What is your opinion on that question?
That was actually one of the questions that Professor Cambry asked me when I was presenting my paper, that horizontal does get more efficient because prosecutors can focus on sort of one type of crime or one part of the process. So you have maybe younger attorneys doing all the preliminary hearings, and you have, you know, more seasoned attorneys doing the actual trials for, you know, felony trials or more sophisticated trials. But I think that ultimately, with the vertical prosecution, it's really not any more inefficient, because you're really getting into the facts of all the case. The amount of time that it takes a new prosecutor to learn the case, you know, after receiving the file and then researching it and preparing it for their portion of the trial. I think if you have somebody who is with the same victim through the entire way, who's doing the prelim, who's doing the trial, who's doing the sentencing phase, then it evens out in terms of efficiency for both ways.
Now, one thing that I feel like the general public hears a lot about when it comes to prosecuting cases are mistakes that are made, evidence getting misplaced, witnesses flipping on the stand. Do you think that switching to a vertical prosecution style in all district attorneys' offices will improve prosecutions?
I think so. I think when you are responsible for a trial throughout the entire process, you have a lot more ownership of it. So all those little mistakes that might be made if you're only looking at it for a certain period of time where you're not necessarily looking at the end goal, then I think all those problems will be solved.
From a victim's perspective, if we lived in a world where all cases were vertically prosecuted, what sort of benefits do you think they would get from a system that worked that way?
I think that they would feel more empowered. One of the things with victims is, you know, they are traumatized in some sense, even if it's just being touched inappropriately once, or if it's a more serious crime. You know, every victim is affected, and you want them to feel like they are part of the process, that it's not only that they're getting justice, but they're dealing with what happened to them. And I think that having a prosecutor who's the person of power in the judicial system for them will help them feel empowered to, you know, move forward and to deal with what happened to them.
Lori, this issue certainly seems close and near and dear to your heart. Is there any personal experience you've had in your life, or maybe in your experience during law school, that has drawn you to advocating for victims' rights and putting victims first in prosecuting crimes?
Well, I would say nothing in particular, but my work at a few DA's offices, you know, I've got to sit in on victims. I worked in the sexual assault team in a DA's offices, and one of the things that really stood out to me was just how it affected them. and how, you know, we really need to make sure that their voices are heard so that they can grow and deal with what happened to them.
Now, for students that might be thinking of taking ethical prosecutions in the future with Professor Karen Cambry, what are some things that you liked about the class that you'd like to share?
What I really liked about the class is you really got to hear sort of an insider's perspective on what being a prosecutor is like and the ethical dilemmas. And Professor Cambry, you know, she was a prosecutor for many years. She has a lot of great stories that she would tell us, and it really encouraged me to want to be a prosecutor and to also be thinking about the things that are going to come up. Because, you know, it's one thing to sit in a classroom and say, oh, if faced with this dilemma, this is what I would do. But it's a lot different when your job is on the line or when you have a lot of pressure on yourselves. And I think that it prepares you to sort of deal with those questions before they even come up, because they will come up, you know, in any prosecutor's office.
Now, Lori, one question that your paper raises for me is the question about victims' witness advocates. Could you please explain to those that don't know what a victims' witness advocate is and how that ties in to a victim-centered approach to prosecutions?
So a lot of prosecutors' offices have victim witness advocates, and they're people who may have a psychology background or a therapeutic background, and they'll help victims with simple things as, you know, reminding them of when their court dates are, helping them get access to the victim compensation fund that the state of California runs for domestic violence victims. It might help them find resources to, you know, get a job or get out of their living situation. So they sort of deal with more behind the scenes, making sure that the victim feels okay and has the right resources to help them.
Thank you very much, Lori, for spending the time with me. I'm really excited about your paper. It's going to be published soon, and I think it's going to start a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.